The Zone Coverage Podcast Network.
We're live.
Wolves Wired podcast. The Minnesota Timberwolves are a playoff team. And I'm not 14 years old. This is great. With me to talk about the fun from Wednesday night, as always, Tom Schreier and Dane Moore. Not present, David Naylor, but in his seat. We've had him on before. He is an Italian journalist covering the NBA in Minneapolis. Riccardo Pratesi, how you doing?
Doing fine. Thank you for having me.
I think, it's important that if they didn't listen to the previous episode, I just think it's really your story, Riccardo, is cool for being here. And obviously it's been cool to get to know you, but just the interest that Italy has in having someone come to Minnesota. You chose to come here over kind of had your choice of the lot of cities to, live in and move to. You moved to Minneapolis because you saw something in this Timberwolves team that was going to be relevant and worth covering.
I saw the story before it happened. And yesterday, 5 minutes before the end, I wasn't so sure that story was happening anymore. But, fortunately, it happened, and it was a story I wanted to talk about, to write about, and to be there, just the way it happened. And again, I've been covering NBA this is my fourth year in a row. So I was in San Antonio covering the Spurs, and then in California covering the Kings and the Warriors especially. And they had many options, but like you said, before this season I thought it was intriguing, the idea of Minnesota Timberwolves finally making the playoff. The roster was there to make it, so I thought it was a good idea to be there covering live this season, and has been rewarding at the end.
What I think is interesting is, so what if you wouldn't have been here? But obviously you follow the NBA. I know that at large you would have been somewhat in tune with what's happening with the Timberwolves. Where do you think your head would have been, say, had you stayed in Golden State for another year? What would your perception of the Timberwolves been, do you think, compared to what it is living in
Since you're on the inside.
Yeah, being at Target Center every day.
First of all, it's been the chance to have, a 360 degrees idea of what the Minnesota Timberwolves are for Minneapolis, for their fan base, and to know, the players better, the organization better. The biggest surprise for me has been Jimmy Butler. And everybody knew that Jimmy Butler was a stud, but I have been so impressed the way he's a leader in that locker room. He's a terrific, tough player, so both ends of the floor, but off the floor he's a guy who likes to joke every time. He's a guy who really loves the game. And sometimes we forget, covering for work, we are professional guys here, reporters, that these guys are kids. Butler is not probably 18, he's not 18 year old, but these guys are young men. Some of them are kids, and sometimes, they should enjoy what they do. And in Butler, you see a guy who really enjoying playing defense, being under pressure, and he enjoyed the kind of game last game was. With everything on the line. He's not afraid of the moment. He enjoyed the moments. He enjoyed the memories he's going to create. And he's not afraid to ask for the ball when everything is on the line.
And it's been like that all season, even in the locker room after games, when they win at least. Butler makes the locker room fun. Like, you can tell that he enjoys it. In the past few years, Tom can attest to this. The locker room, even after wins, wasn't an exciting place to be. The report, and that's not a unique story, but like when you would go in after a win, even you talk to Wiggins, you talk to Towns, you talk to Ricky, you talk to Zach LaVine, and then you'd leave. But with Jimmy Butler there, the locker room can be like a fun event. And Tom Thibodeau's talked about it all year, but the culture change really happened with Jimmy Butler specifically. A lot of acquisitions happen, and maybe it's an obvious statement because of what he did on the court, but even off the floor, Jimmy Butler changed the team.
the surprise for me was that he's such an intense guy, and a lot of these guys are kind of who they are on and off the court. Wiggins, quiet guy, right? Off the court, kind of plays stealthily, silently most of the time, sometimes sleepily. Towns is probably very by the book, and I think if you look at his game, it seems kind of like, he was really taught the fundamentals well. There's that little shot he has where he fades back, has to be perfectly balanced to go in at the rate it does or whatever. Butler, I expected to be kind of like a football player. He loves football. He's a very intense guy. I always say he has that Adrian Peterson look in his face, prime Adrian Peterson, when he was going to run a guy down. The camera would catch it perfectly, and you'd kind of get a shiver, and you can imagine being a linebacker trying to tackle him.
Tenacity mixed with elite physicality.
Yeah.
That's what I think of with Adrian Peterson, and you see that with Jimmy Butler on a chase down block, or like the one play that sticks out to me was I think fourth quarter right before the All-Star break. We went up and had those two blocks in the same possession. Do you remember that? And it's this ability to go to another level when the moment calls for it. And pretty much every time the moment has called for it from Jimmy Butler, maybe you haven't got the result, but you've gotten the energy and the work and the process of what you need out of a best player. And Tim, just listening to you talk, I think about going back 6 months ago and what were the goals for the season? Culture change, playoffs. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole bunch of bullet points along that way. And I know just from talking to all three of you over the course of the year, we have frustrations that some of those bullet points, there wasn't check marks put next to. But those, I think, were the two goals of the season, and they have both been achieved, and in the big picture, that makes this season at worst okay.
And I mean, I was talking to a gentleman, I forget his name, before the game yesterday, and I think he made a great point. And I mean, we've talked about this to a degree before. If you told me, or I think any of us at the beginning of the year, that Jimmy Butler was going to miss 20 games or so, but the Wolves would win 47 games. Their over-under was 48.5 before the season started, and they'd have to play Denver on the season finale to get into the playoffs because the Western Conference was just so loopy. I don't think I know very many people that would say that sounds like a failure. I mean, obviously, like you said, there are a lot of little things in between. The defense never got better. Wiggins' offense stunted a little bit. Karl Anthony Towns' defense, I mean, the whole team's defense was a problem. Jeff Teague had his problems, et cetera, et cetera. But that end result, when you compare it to the 31 wins the year prior with Tom Thibodeau, and obviously the 13 years of no playoffs prior, it's big picture, like you said. I mean, it's a success story, I think.
Riccardo, how fair are the criticisms, the issues that you see with the team? How crucial are those? I mean, I just know that you've been one of the more vocal people that has had frustrations with, the players to coaching to the organization.
Well, I think there are two different and parallel, maybe, ways to judge this team. I mean, the grand scheme of things, like you said, you have to say that
for this year, the grand scheme for this year is different than the grand scheme for 5 years.
Yeah. I would say that I agree that it's been positive. I mean, Timberwolves didn't make it for 13 years in a row. They did it, and like you said, they got in Jimmy Butler, the leader that they really needed, and they, like Tim said, changed completely the mentality and the air you breathe within the franchise. At the same time, to me, and this is a personal opinion, I do believe that the team underachieved. So if you rationalize, putting in your professional standpoint, you said, okay, but for what they got, did they make the best of it?
Sure.
And I don't think so. Mm-hmm. So I think there are two different ways to judge it, and one doesn't necessarily mean that the other is wrong.
Yeah.
You can just, take both of them in consideration and just go with it.
And what I think is interesting is if, again, going back to the beginning of this season, and we could say that 6 months from now, we know that the two things will have changed. That a culture change would have occurred. The air, that as you put it, would have changed, and the playoffs would have been achieved. That I would have thought that I would be much more optimistic about the next 3 or 4 years. And I think what you're saying, and it is my personal opinion, is I still have some big concerns about the big picture, which is 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And obviously that starts at the top with Tom Thibodeau. Of course it does. And it's hard for me to sit here today, though, and go down that rabbit hole because, again, this year it worked. And that is who Tom Thibodeau is. He is a one thing at a time type of person. But there are many red flags that the next steps he might not be able to achieve.
How different is this team? I saw you tweet about it once, and I've seen John Krasinski tweet about it once. How different is this team if they win half of those awful losses to tanking teams? I think they lost 10 games to 5 of the worst 7 teams, or 6 of the worst 7 teams in the NBA. And I think you tweeted had they won 4 of those, they would have locked in the 3 of those. Not even. They would have locked in the 3 seed.
Today, I was just looking at the final standings. They lost twice to the Blazers this season. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If they win one of those 2 games, they're the 3 seed.
And those were both without Butler.
Both without Butler.
So let's discuss this because there are some nuances to this. They have won games against teams you would not expect them to beat, right? Mm-hmm. Which you have to. The margin between 3 and 10, as we found, was very small. So this is why every single game matters. What's interesting is Tibbs seems to repeat that over and over, right? That you have to have good routine and practice habits, that you have to be intense all the time, this and that.
No, I agree. I was shaking my head, and you can see, but they can see, so they were laughing already.
That's usually my job here is the head shakers.
I think that, again, there are 2 different ways about Tibbs. First of all, my first problem, and I was referring to this now, shaking my head, is because I think you can make a lot of criticism about the way he coach. At the end of the day, the goal was to make the playoff, so the guy deserves some credit. Anyway, no matter what, by even his biggest detractors or whatever. Still, you can make a lot of you can have a lot of criticism out there, the way he coach, the style of play that Minnesota play that is not amusing or that is not cool, if you sure. will. And also the coaching when the game is on the line, that is not, you don't see the ball movement, you don't see the choices to be the choice many fans would like to see on the floor.
Sure.
Sometimes it looks a little bit, the style looks a little bit grit and grind, but a little bit obsolete if you think of how the modern NBA is going on. The 3-pointers, the ball movement. Just one big man, 2 big men on the floor, and then spacing the floor with a smaller lineup. So this is the biggest criticism that everybody has his take on that. But everybody see that. They decline different ways. But everybody who follow the Timberwolves has his take and see these things. And at a different level, have his criticism about it. I have another criticism about Tibbs, and it's about how he relates with people. And that means, in my opinion, first of all, his players, because these are his guys.
Yeah.
Butler and Gibson are his guys and won the game yesterday for the Timberwolves.
That's true.
They are loyal. They are his guys. He brought him here, so he deserves credit to bring these guys here. And I'm the first one to say he brought these guys here. Yeah. So good for him. At the same time, you see Wiggins and you see Towns, and I'm not sure they are on the same page in terms of communication
with Tibbs.
Mm-hmm. And that's what troubled me the most looking forward, because those 2 guys are supposed to be, or at least, I don't know if I should say we're supposed to be in terms of Wiggins, referring to Wiggins now, but the future of this franchise.
Yeah.
And honestly, if he wasn't able in a couple of years to establish a relationship in terms of communication, in terms of complicity with these 2 guys, I'm not sure how we can expect that to improve going forward. And speaking in terms of communication, from where we start this topic, I'm worried the way Tibbs is perceived from his fan base. I don't see once again them being on the same page. It's like one don't understand the other. And I mean, this guy is not only the coach that brought back the playoff after 14 years, but he's also the president of the basketball operation. So I mean, he's the heart and soul right now of this franchise. If the fan base doesn't like him, somehow they will never appreciate completely the accomplishments this group of guys are gonna do.
Exactly. And that's what I wanted to say earlier was that I think you would have the same opinion even if the Wolves do win that Blazers game, or if they even won 2 or 3 more games and got the 3 seed. This still overarching elephant in the room of the Tibbs issue, the lack of communication, and the big picture.
That's why I asked originally, had they won half of those quote-unquote awful games, because, I mean, those problems still persist in terms of just the schematics of how he runs offense and defense. But from a fan perspective, I wonder how much that is the underlying issue, because I think it's much easier to look at, they lost to Memphis twice. They lost to Phoenix twice. They lost to Orlando. They lost to Atlanta, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's an easier thing for fans to grip onto. So if you cut that in half, and you also, I think you would have locked the 3 seed up a couple games ago. Again, just from a fan's perspective, I can see how...
Well, I think they don't like Tibbs.
Right.
And then they grasp onto those things as...
But that's easy
anecdotes.
ammo as a fan
Yes,
as well.
Exactly.
And if you're clinching up the 3 seed where the top 2 is this tier by itself, and you're clinching up the 3 seed while the rest of the West is in sort of a scramble mode, I think it makes it easier for Tibbs to be not liked by fans, but not disliked either, where I think there's a little bit more of a divisiveness right now.
I'm not sure if they would like him, though, even if they would have been the
That's my
seed.
question. I have no idea, but I think it would be easier.
Because of what Riccardo was saying.
Right.
There's not this... In the big picture, something feels off.
Sure.
And I think specifically to the Minnesota fan base, and Riccardo, I think you get this to some degree, but not the extent that all of us would have, having lived here in Minnesota for so long, is Flip was exactly what you're describing, the ideal as a person, as a communicator. He was Minnesota. Minnesota's a unique place. He fit exactly into the mold of what Minnesota wanted. And then you bring in Tom Thibodeau, that even if he was the same caliber of president of basketball operations and coach, basketball mind, he's a different shape that doesn't fit into that mold that Minnesota desires. The hope is that the fans' mold can evolve to fit Thibodeau, because I think what we've seen is Thibodeau's not changing. This is...
So I think what would have to change, we focused on there's 2 aspects here. There's him communicating with the fans and people at large. There's him communicating to his teammates, which I think, or not his teammates, but his players.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. I think the second one's very important. Like, if his players take on his mentality, and we saw how important Taj was in that game, the defensive possessions, how important Butler is at large, right? Mm-hmm. That he comes back and kind of changes some dynamics. We said maybe they pull off the game in Denver if he's there. Maybe for sure, I think they win the game against Memphis that they lost. You need Towns and Wiggins to buy in, at least in some extent, or you got to figure out what you're doing, especially with Wiggins. At this point, I don't think you ever move on from Towns, but Wiggins, that's still up in the air, even with his big contract. I think evidence of them not buying in is the games in Orlando and Atlanta and these bad teams that they continue to lose to. Like, if you have a routine and you are up for every game, I just don't think you see the same performance that you did where it seemed like on a Wednesday they just kind of had skipped by it mentally.
Right. And in theory, if those 2 buy in, I mean, if they buy in, that means that in theory they're a better defensive individual, or they're both better defensive individuals, and then just by association they become a better defensive team, right? I mean, again, that's in theory. And if you eliminate the questions over Tibbs and his ability to connect with his non-Timber Bulls or whatever, is it easier for fans to latch on then? I mean, what's it going to take? I can see how...
What's it going to take for the fans to...
For the fans, right. So, like, when he was in Chicago, for example, I think he was essentially the same way, but they were really, really good. So I think...
Chicago has a different mold, though, too.
Right, but even on a national scale, Thibodeau was seen as kind of a grumpy guy, but a grumpy guy that got the job done, that had the best defense in the NBA and was the best team in the East with the exception of Miami at that time. If like the Wolves aren't anywhere near that status right now, but is that what it's going to take? I mean,
it's going to take a lot to get this taste out of the mouth,
right.
out of their mouth.
What if, I'm not saying I believe that, what if that personnel in Chicago fit perfectly Tibbs,
I think,
and is not able with a different personnel to be flexible enough to adjust to his best guys?
Let's talk about who those people are. Like, as generation of age, you look at Jimmy Butler is the youngest of that group, and you go up all the way to Luol Deng, who's 33. So it's all these people that, were born in the late 80s, right? And so that's, I think they still fall into the millennial grouping, but they're late millennials versus Towns and Wiggins and Tyus, who are born in the late 90s. And I think inherently that's just a decade makes a difference in the type of person you are. And then you throw in personal factors of who Jimmy was coming from nothing, Taj coming from Brooklyn. Luol was
escaping from Sudan.
It's a very different person.
Noah's kind of an exception, but he came into the NBA as like a do-it-all defensive player. That's a perfect Tibbs prototype center. Actually,
Noah pre-NBA life was very similar to Wiggins with professional sports parents.
Exactly.
But it's that mold of a person that I think Thibodeau just clicks with. So it allows them to be extensions of each other. And my concern is, I don't know which one's more of a bigger concern, but it's that being a late generation millennial and growing up in a different environment. I think those factors show up in who Andrew Wiggins are and Karl Towns are. I don't think those things can change. And Tom Thibodeau has never shown the ability to relate to that type of person.
And we can add, you did it before, you can add, I guess, in my opinion, Tyus Jones to this conversation. Because Tyus Jones is not at the same level of, he's not going to be a franchise player, but he's a guy who can be very precious for this franchise. Because he's Minnesotan. He's a guy from here. He's a local hero. Yeah. So he could be the link, with the new grit and grind. And the local hero, very smart guy, very good guy. Likable guy. So he would have been a perfect bridge, in my opinion, if he's successful for, from the fan standpoint and Thibodeau standpoint.
But he is not connected to Thibodeau at this point.
Not at all.
That is not at all. Even though Tyus has had a very good year.
Yeah, but
in fact, I think you can make the case, and I have no insider information to back this up, but
the most alienated, right?
Well, I was going to say, I think a big part of the reason why he was brought here is because a Minnesotan was here to draft him. Flip Saunders drafted him. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at the time, Flip was, in addition to trying to build a good basketball team, he was trying to make Minnesota, or the Timberwolves, a brand again. So I think bringing in a Minnesotan like Tyus Jones, at worst, you've got that hometown feel-good story. He's turned into a good player, but I think that's got to be part of it, right?
This should be pointed out. Flip Saunders is actually from Cleveland. How he became a Minnesotan was coming here to play for the Gophers, right? Yeah. And I think he figured out, he's Yeah, no, and I agree, and I don't think it's wrong to call him Minnesotan at this point. But Tibbs can adapt in some capacity. I understand he's a stubborn individual. I think it's actually more important that he communicates with his players.
Can somebody do that at 50 years old? I don't think so. Even if it was a less stubborn person, I think that Flip came here when he was 18. And you're still kind of a kid, and
right. It's their formative years in college.
Yeah,
and then he coached the team for a decade. He even if Tom Thibodeau coaches this team for a decade, he doesn't have that, like you said, he doesn't have that childhood or early adulthood history.
He's never going to.
He wasn't molded by Minnesota as a young adult the way that Flip was.
He identifies with Connecticut and the East Coast.
Yep.
That's and I
guess technically he coached here with a mullet in 1988, but that doesn't really count.
So my question is, what do you think about Tyus Jones' future?
As a player or
No,
with the
it's gonna be
Timberwolves?
here. No,
Predictive.
Do you imagine him being here just next season? Because I mean, it wouldn't be.
Dane, I'll let you go first.
I think he's up for a rookie contract extension. He's not at the level of player that normally gets a rookie contract extension. Those are almost always reserved for at least starter caliber, probably top 1, 2, or 3 level players on the team. Sometimes those contract extensions happen. My assumption would be that they do not pursue a rookie contract extension, kind of like the Lakers did it with Julius Randle. I would put those.
And if you're right, and if it happens, do you think that is a lost opportunity, is a wasted opportunity to create that bridge from the fan base to Thibodeau using a guy like?
Well, he can still stay. He can still stay without getting the contract extensions. But that's what I would predict would happen. And then the optimistic view is that he could be that bridge. I wouldn't assume that bridge is created, while I think it would make a lot of sense, because I think what we've seen with Thibodeau is he decides kind of early if a guy is his guy or not his guy. He did the same thing with Ricky Rubio, and the opposite of that with Chris Dunn. I think Gorgui Dieng has fallen into the Rubio bin. I think Tyus falls into the Rubio bin. And the guys that he brings in, Teague, he puts, an irrational level of faith in. There's this pretty clear demarcation where you could go down the lineup and say, Tibbs guy, not Tibbs guy.
Is it premature? It's kind of an elephant in the room in terms of Tyus Jones' future. Is it premature to say that Derrick Rose has already become a Tibbs guy for next year?
I think he's back for sure next year.
I think he's back next year, and I don't blame Tyus Jones in the slightest if they offer him something. If he says, Well, first of all, I don't think they're going to offer him anything if they offer Derrick Rose anything. Even if they see Derrick Rose as an off guard, which is what they've played him as the entire season.
They might offer him, and Tyus might say, I'm waiting to see where we're at.
That's kind of what I'm thinking. Would Tyus Jones want to stay here if he knows Jeff Teague's here for at least another year, probably more, and Derrick Rose is probably back? Why would you want to stay when you're only getting 10 minutes a game, even though I think he has plenty, his resume is good enough now where he can get a decent deal somewhere else and get more playing time on a team that would probably value his production more, frankly.
And I think just from some people I've talked to is that Tyus would leave. He would leave. He's not like I need to stay home type of person. That he, just like he went to Duke, he would be willing to do that. I think he would come back after his playing career and live in Minnesota, loves Minnesota. But I think Tyus is thinking about himself, as he should to some extent. He thinks that he can be a starting level point guard in the NBA. And there might be a blockade here in Minnesota that never lets him get there, or at least not in the next few years.
I think to be a starter makes sense. What is the ideal Tibbs backup in your mind?
Tyus Jones.
In which case Tibbs should keep him happy. Yeah. I think that's in the best interest of both parties.
Tyus Jones is a very good backup point guard, but he's
not going to start for the Wolves.
I want to peel back on
you're
that.
Right.
I think his ideal backup point guard, if we go up on what happened in Chicago, was you saw high volume offensive weapon backup point guards.
Aaron Brooks at his
Nate
best,
Robinson,
right?
Aaron Brooks. It was those guys. Even John Lucas III when he was back, they scored a lot, and they came in when Rose was either on the bench or injured, and they were very high volume scoring type players, not necessarily distributors, which is Tyus's archetype.
I think you are introducing another very interesting topic, because we complain a lot about the aesthetic of Minnesota Timberwolves basketball. That is not good, honestly, rationally. Yeah. And I think part of that is how Tibbs see his point guard here, because he's not only not a distributor, and Tyus Jones would be the perfect distributor, so it becomes even more a bigger contentions, because you don't just want Tyus Jones playing more because he's playing so well, because he's from here. So people tend to like him no matter what. But because they see him like the perfect fit to make the Wiggins of the situation, the Towns down the stretch of the situation, they know more hero ball by Butler situation much easier, because if you got a guy who shared the ball, who got everyone involved offensively, they're gonna be much more motivated defensively. And I mean, the ball moves better, everybody's rhythm. It's easier to play a more enjoyable brand of basketball. But my point, and you were introducing that, is that Thibodeau seems to like a different kind of point guard. And Jeff Teague, no matter how his shortcomings defensively are so big, and his decision-making can be very frustrating sometimes, but he's a guy who scores. He attacks the basket, is not afraid of the moment, and Tibbs seems to
Love that.
Love that.
And with Tyus Jones as the backup point guard, he didn't see that in Tyus. And, I mean, in theory, that makes the Jamal Crawford signing make a lot more sense, because despite all of his shortcomings, which I think his defense is, I mean, it's Teague plus some, his decision-making is worse. But he's also a guy that is willing to attack and is not at all terrified of the moment. He took the last shot in regulation in the fourth quarter. I mean, as horrible of a shot as it was with the second and change to go. But, I mean, is it possible that they brought in Jamal Crawford to kind of be a pseudo Nate Robinson, Aaron Brooks in his prime type point guard if Tyus wasn't able to bring it? I mean, yeah, a lot of time, especially at the beginning of the season, Jamal Crawford, not Tyus Jones, was the one bringing up the ball. So maybe they just wanted an attacker bringing up the ball in addition. I don't know.
I would love to know from Thibodeau why it is that he loves that type of player. What is, because he's not an illogical person. There's a reason, and when I've thought about that is why do you want to have a team of guys who can isolate and get a shot up late? And what I think it is, I'm trying to justify, trying to get in his head and find that is the goal is to work the possession so as to get a very easy shot, a layup, a wide open layup. And then if the shot clock goes down too far, having confidence in, okay, we didn't get the layup, but we still have three players who, when the green call comes, 5 seconds left on the shot clock, can get up a shot. And it worked. Like, at the end of the day, the offense worked. From a points perspective, they got a lot of those easy, if we break it down really simply, they got a lot of those easy layups, and they converted with less than 5 seconds on the shot clock better than most teams did in the league. I'm with you, Riccardo. I would love it if it was modern basketball, but we have to also acknowledge the fact that for bringing in those pieces that you're talking about, to some extent, that did work in the regular season. Playoffs is another question.
So I'm interested. I think we know how it's going to go win-loss, right? It's probably going to be LLLL, right? And they're out.
Most likely.
But we will learn how Tibbs thinks through and deploys his players.
It's going to be extremely informative as to who Tibbs is because you can, I mean, watching a coach in the playoffs turns inside out everything they are, everything they desire, because the team is countering it. I mean, every game is a chess match. Is okay, you moved your bishop here, we're moving our knight here. I mean, we're going to learn so much about who Tom Thibodeau is, and if Mike D'Antoni can just kick his ass.
Right. I think the point is we looked at what they did last offseason and how it manifested itself during play, right, in 82 games in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. We're expecting an overhaul, right, in the next offseason, no matter really what happens here, unless they somehow get in the second round. But
are we expecting that, or is that?
I mean, are you want that? Are you? No, I mean, do you
roster wise?
Yeah, don't you think Tibbs is going to move Gorgie or try to move Gorgie and try to kind of? No,
I think it's just really hard to do.
I mean, if you mean overhaul, you mean move Gorgie and potentially Tyus, so maybe reshuffle the bench, but overhaul might be
overhaul maybe wrong. Overhaul the bench.
Yeah, maybe it's possible.
I think fans want an overhaul.
I think he's a conservative guy. There's no way we can go out from this assumption.
He still only made one trade.
Okay,
and it's the Jimmy Butler trade, which to most people was a
to be fair that was wise.
For sure, that's what I'm saying. It has to be that obvious for him to make a trade.
I mean, also he brought in Derrick Rose, okay, but everybody was screaming probably rightfully, for a defensive wingman, and he never arrived. And every time we asked Tom Thibodeau about is someone is coming or not, I like what we got. I think we got enough. That's what always said. Even without Jimmy, he said we got enough. We just have to get better. More. His mantra is we got just to go game by game, become more experienced. So I don't expect a huge overhaul.
And I mean, you talked about waiting for a defensive guard. Tom, how many times has Tom Thibodeau, since they signed Derrick Rose, mentioned how important Derrick Rose is to adding to the defense?
Literally with
several times.
No,
right?
literally with the Memphis game, almost a direct quote was his defense, his aggressiveness would have influenced the outcome of the Memphis game. Like I guess I was a little surprised by that. I don't think of that with Derrick Rose.
Well, I mean, at practice after, or maybe it was shoot around yesterday morning. I think it was practice the day prior. Someone asked him about the win over Memphis, and he brought up the defense. He brought up three people: Jimmy, Taj, and Derrick Rose. So I think he sees Derrick Rose as a defensive piece off the bench, and not. I mean, to his credit, I don't think he sees Derrick Rose as Derrick Rose Chicago anymore, which is good. But I also think he sees him as a defensive stopper to a certain degree, and he has been a better defender than I expected. But I find that interesting, and I'm really interested to see how he uses Rose specifically in this series, where the starting backcourt for Houston features two of the best, most dynamic guards in the last 15 years.
How about this in terms of buy-in? Because it is important, going back to this, that Wiggins and Towns do. I think it's much more likely that Towns does. I think Towns is a pleaser. I think he wants people to, A, like him, but B, kind of be on his side, right? And he somehow he made it happen with Garnett, who Garnett is a crazy personality, right? Not really Towns-like.
But also very leadership is very important to Kevin Garnett.
Yeah.
So I think he was going to direct him no matter how Towns was as a personality.
Butler.
If DeMarcus Cousins was a Wolf and Kevin Garnett had come back, I think Kevin Garnett would have done everything in his power to mentor DeMarcus Cousins despite all of his character flaws.
Yeah. I guess my point is I think Towns will put an honest effort forth, and there's probably something that could happen there. The flip side is I think Wiggins is still an open question mark. Like I think he's his own dude, and it's kind of hard to.
Do we think that Towns? So how do we think Towns and Wiggins are going to do in the playoffs? Because I think that's an interesting question. Because I think on one hand, Towns is big on playing on the big stage and impressing people, but I mean he also has a tendency to. I don't want to say overthink, but kind of overthink things and get himself a little too hyped up. And that could be a problem in the playoffs, especially with a guy like Clint Capella being matched up against him, who's, I think, going to be calm and collected in the first round.
I think this next series coming, is going to be important, especially for Towns. And I want to explain myself further than that. I still think that the Jimmy Butler clan, if you want to call it like this way, doesn't trust Karl Anthony Towns, the All-Star, or whoever he is, down the stretch. I really don't think so. Because if they would, Tibbs would trust him more down the stretch. To me, to see Towns completely ignored in the offense down the stretch in the most important game of the season, I'm not a huge fan of Towns down the stretch, but it was surprising. I was surprised.
And that wasn't an isolated incident.
Yeah,
that has happened in numerous close games.
Exactly. So I think that he has to prove, Towns, not to his critics, not to the fans, but to his own teammates, the one that count the most on that locker room, that he can be a guy who really make the difference, not just in terms of statistics, but when the game is on the line, when the season is on the line. And I think so far, as good as he has been offensively and has been pretty good, he didn't do yet.
Can I be a devil's advocate for a second?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would point to, well, Karl Anthony Towns hasn't necessarily gotten many opportunities to show it, and the opportunities he has gotten. And I think the best case of that is the win against Golden State with Butler out. He was outstanding, and he hit a bunch of big shots down the stretch. How much of this is, I guess, wrongly not trusting Towns, and how much of it is actually on Towns himself for needing to go out and make those opportunities happen for
I don't
himself?
think it's Towns at all. I think it's exactly what we were just talking about of the style of play, of the isolation type player at the end of the. I mean, to utilize a big man in a high volume way, you need to have an offense that siphons the ball there. And for Towns to get as few touches and as few shots as he does, when he is able to be used in literally every spot on the offensive floor, is a glaring sign of the fact that the offense doesn't get him the ball. And Tim, as you said, when he has got the ball, end of games, he can do it. But it is definitively not the goal of the Timberwolves offense to get Towns the ball. I mean, let's look at one example is last night. I mean, he didn't. His final shot in regulation was with 6:17 left in the fourth quarter, and it was a tip-in. He didn't get another shot the rest of the way, and particularly under 2 minutes, they went through Butler. It was a screen. They used Gibson to screen for Butler or Teague, and Teague or Butler went to the basket, or on the one play, it got kicked out to Taj for a 15-footer. Towns is not even involved in those actions.
So I got two questions for you, because I agree with what you're saying. I mean, first of all is, how do you think his defense
Factors into that?
That's a good question.
And the second is, going forward, how do you see this situation changing with the personnel remaining probably, like we said before, the same, with the same Teague running the point, the same Butler being the alpha dog, and Wiggins, if he stays, somehow has to touch the ball because he's a scorer.
I weirdly think it's once Taj leaves.
That's probably fair. Sorry, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Even last night's game, Nikola Jokic at the end of the game was guarding Taj Gibson, and I don't necessarily blame Tom Thibodeau for this because Nikola Jokic is a poor defender. They were running pick and roll with Jeff Teague and Taj Gibson because they were trying to get the switch and create two mismatches to take advantage of, which is smart because getting Jamal Murray on Taj Gibson, who's a sound post player, or Jeff Teague off the dribble with Nikola Jokic is a good idea. But to do that over just the overall dynamic offensive game of Karl Anthony Towns, just because Paul Millsap is guarding, who is a good defensive player, I find that incredibly interesting.
But it wasn't on the last play. Jokic was guarding Towns on the Butler fadeaway 20-footer. Why would you have Gibson go? The goal of that play was to get a switch on the pick and roll. Why would you send Gibson as the screen rather than Towns? I mean, I see no reason because you can get a Jokic switch and you can involve Towns in the play. To me, it says we do not want Towns involved in the play. I trust Jimmy and Taj to not mess it up, so that I think it was hyper control to that.
So you're not going to see it changing going forward in a short term.
If they're
not in the playoffs.
If they're going to pay, I shouldn't say if they're going to pay Karl money, they have to trust him because they paid Andrew money, and I mean we've been talking about Karl, but Andrew Wiggins is already signed this contract, and he did he score in the fourth quarter? I don't know if he did. Did he score? I don't think he scored in overtime.
So, 2 points here. First of all, they're going to have to trust Towns in the sense.
He made those huge free throws. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, he made huge free throws. But he didn't get any looks in an offensive set.
Still a fair point. And I think, first of all, they're going to have to trust Towns because Taj is just at some point going to age out. Like, I just think he will hit a wall here as he gets into his 30s.
Maybe it's like a rite of passage thing for Towns.
Right. And the contract thing is a huge point. I think to meet Towns halfway, however, it's not just give him the sheet of paper. It's we're going to run the offense through you, but you have to be bought in. Does that make sense? Like they have to they have to start creating plays for him, I think, to get buy-in from him.
I think he's bought in. I think he would very willingly set the screen for Jimmy and say, Jimmy, I still want you to take. I'm cool with the play being, Jimmy, you get the final shot. I'm option B if they blitz the screen,
which is the right way to play.
Drop it off to Towns. I think Towns is totally cool for now, being option B in the hierarchy of that.
I think my broader point here is for him to become a Tibbs guy, to really buy into his mentality? I think that's more what I'm getting at.
I think to do that, he should play better defense. I mean, it's pretty simple.
I think that's a good point. I really think that's a good point, too.
I mean, the simple answer is the right answer it is. Tibbs will trust him the moment he starts playing good defense. And he didn't see that moment because nobody sees that moment yet.
No.
He played that 3 weeks of good defense during the season after the Embiid remarks, and that was it. And you are not going to become Tibbs' guy if you don't play that kind of defense. If he didn't choose you no matter what, because Tig is not playing good defense, but he chose Tig. So, he was his guy since the beginning.
Right.
Which is, by the way, a mistake by Tibbs. I mean, that to some degree, you need to make offense and defense mutually exclusive things. Like, at some point, utilize your best offensive player, even if he's not playing defense. Like, that's what the Nuggets do with Jokic. I hear what you're saying, and that is when he's going to get in with Tibbs, is once he starts playing defense. But I mean, that is like the quintessential example of Tibbs' stubbornness. Right?
How was Derrick Rose as a defender with Chicago? Like he was covered up by the other four guys to a certain degree, right? But at the end of the game, who did Tom Thibodeau trust the most?
I think Tibbs just defines good defense so different than we do.
Yeah,
and
that's probably true.
And what do we also say all the time? Defensive. For all of us, and I think we all know a lot about basketball X's and O's wise, but at the end of the day, we rely a lot on statistics to determine defense, and we also admit the inherent flaws in those defensive statistics. Tibbs doesn't care about that, and he is purely the eye test of Derrick Rose. Like, I see engagement at the point of attack. That's what he says when you ask him of what do you define good defense as?
I would go farther. He's just trusting. He's trusting that goes beyond the stats, that goes beyond the eye test. Even if they don't play good defense for a couple of plays, if he trusts the guy,
I don't trust him to do exactly what I want him to do.
To execute somehow what he's asking them to do.
Yeah.
Right or wrong. I personally disagree, but I mean, he's who he is, so you can't change a guy with 60. I mean,
and I find that interesting because, I mean, we go back to the point guard debate. I think just in terms of what Tibbs, I think, wants in a point guard, I don't think anyone exemplifies two-way basketball and smart decision-making on this team more than Tyus. But then it goes back to Tyus was acquired by Flip Saunders, whereas Jeff Teague and Derrick Rose were acquired by Tom Thibodeau, and I think that makes a difference.
I agree. I think the going to Taj and Butler is not all that different from his minutes distribution. And where I'm going with this is I think Tibbs thinks very in the moment. Who do I, going back to the trust, who do I trust to get it done? And literally, who do I think are my best players on the floor? And you may scale it back, and I think we tend to do this, which is smart, as we look at not just the picture in that minute, but throughout the game, and then the implications going further, like into next year almost in this offseason.
Like he would have never done with Andrew Wiggins what Flip did with Andrew Wiggins that first year.
Yeah.
Andrew, get your 22 shots a game. Like,
just don't float. That's basically what he said.
Yeah.
Even with Levine, you wouldn't make him a point guard because he's not. But it probably helped his development as a player.
Flip was much more, and I guess that was much more a creative.
Yes.
And whereas Tibbs is like a rationalist.
And then just to tie the minutes in, I'll get so. Same thing with the minutes. We're looking at the first quarter of the season, and we're like, oh, my God. Like, this is just absurd how much they played. And you got to play 3 more quarters of the season, and you guys have to be in top shape because it may come down to one game to get in the playoffs, let alone you have to have energy for the playoffs.
Sure.
And it just seems like Tibbs he's obviously smart enough to figure out, like, you can't burn your dudes out, but it's like in that moment he's like, no, I need my starters, I need my guy, I know Jimmy and Taj, right? I just need to win this game. And that is like the conflict between a coach and a manager traditionally, right? And he's both, and that's an interesting dynamic.
And that's kind of why I think the comparison of Flip's creativeness and Tibbs's, I guess for lack of a better word, stubbornness to a certain degree with minutes might not be fair, because I don't think Tom Thibodeau would ever take a job for the long term with a roster makeup like the one Flip had when Wiggins was a rookie. And on top of that, I don't think a front office would ever want to hire a Tom Thibodeau for a team like that because of that stubbornness. Tom Thibodeau, the appeal of him when the Wolves got him was he can make them good quickly because of the way that he coaches to a certain degree. He plays a certain style of defense, and the players play in this certain sort of system, which turns out to not be a very aesthetically pleasing system, but history suggests that it works. When Flip was there, I think part of the appeal of Flip was that he was that creative and that he could get certain things out of Wiggins and Levine and was willing to wait because he was also the general manager and all this other stuff, which I understand Tom Thibodeau's the general manager, but I guess what I'm suggesting is I don't think he would ever take a job with the pre-Wiggins Timberwolves.
He literally sat for a year, evaluated every team, and was like, this is the situation I can win in right now. And the funny thing about that is, yes, we have to look at his accomplishment, 31 wins to 47. That's great. Mm-hmm. But he did win 31 games with a quote-unquote win-down team.
29.
Right, exactly, with Sam Mitchell, who was not great, right? So, like
the worst in the NBA, probably.
Yeah, and so they haven't won now, and not only that, but in the second season, they put themselves in a position where you don't have home court advantage. It's not a series you can win. In fact, if you're even looking at playoff experience exclusively, you're going to get 4 games instead of potentially 6 or 7.
So I think this whole idea of Tibbs punching it home translates interestingly to this Houston series with a Houston team that has just battered the crap out of the Wolves.
Yep.
With particularly pick and rolls, right? Just set a high ball screen, wait for them to make a mistake.
Again and again and
lay
again.
up, kick, whatever. And so what I think is really interesting is Tom Thibodeau can kind of go through this in 2 ways. He can stay steadfast with his belief of, you know what you need to do it. You know what your job is when they set a screen, when they set a Capella Harden screen, or when they set a Gordon Harden screen. Like, you know what your jobs are, do your job. Or you can acknowledge the fact that this team cannot do that job. They can't do that. They cannot do that. We have never, ever seen them do that. So, then you change your game plan.
It's not going to happen.
But let me finish. Let me finish. You blitz every ball screen. You have the athletes to blitz every ball screen and try and create chaos on there. It's not going to happen, but it will never, ever, ever work.
That's the thing.
To defend them the way that they have the past 4 games, which is just simple dropping the big man.
I'm not saying you are not right. I'm saying it's not going to happen.
And that right there, if everything I said is right,
I think so.
That right there is reason to fire Tibbs.
Well, do you fire?
You try an example that has no shot at working,
No.
or one that at least has a shot.
Or it doesn't have to be that particular thing, right? Just
it's
something.
That archetype of idea that I'm willing to try something that I know cannot work because I believe in it.
What about? Go ahead, Tim.
Oh, well, the thing about these two teams, and I think it's exactly what you're saying, Dane, is I think the Wolves have played the best style of basketball that they can play against Houston before. Like, offensively and even defensively, they've looked okay against Houston, but they still lose by 18, 20 points because Houston's attack involves 3-point shooting and the Wolves' attack involves 2-point shooting. And when you factor in the inconsistent defense the Wolves play, it is impossible, despite how close they are in offensive rating, for the Timberwolves to beat the Rockets this year. And Dane, if I'm gathering what you're saying correctly, what you're suggesting is if that is true, they have to switch something up. Like, there's no other option around it. If they truly want to beat Houston, they can't just do the Tom Thibodeau Timberwolves style.
At least mix in one of every 5 ball screens, or you're coming out of timeout. Hey, for the next 2 minutes, we're jumping every ball screen. Do that. Mix that up. And they did that last night to start overtime, because what at the end of regulation, what did the Nuggets do over and over? Jamal Murray and Jokic screens. They jumped them. They jumped the first 2 ball screens of overtime, and it forces you to change what you're doing offensively. It might lead to a wide open layup. A lot of the times, if you have disciplined passers, it'll be bing bing layup. But it changed it. So it's not that Tibbs has never done anything else. It's that he uses it as a rare audible. And I'm just saying, turn that up to at least 25% of the time.
How about this? Like, you have 4 games to work with, right? And you talked about the chess match. Mm-hmm. Tibbs may come out, in fact, almost certainly will come out with his own style. Do your job my way, right? I think the question is, does he adjust in game 2? Because if you literally go and do the same thing in game 2 in the same arena, like all that, I'd be like, come on, dude.
And to Tibbs' credit, or maybe not to Tibbs' credit, but in his defense, I mean, I didn't watch him terribly closely or his coaching habits in Chicago. Maybe he doesn't treat the regular season the same way he does the playoffs. Maybe he's more willing to adapt in the playoffs because of what's at stake. I mean, if what you said is true about the way they started attacking screens differently in the overtime game, I mean, they knew what was at stake there. Mm-hmm. So maybe against Houston, they're willing to adapt as well. I don't know. It's a possibility. Just throwing that out there.
Riccardo, you think there's no shot? Do you think they just drop Towns into pick and roll every single time?
I think it's going to be tough. It's the worst matchup possible for them. And, I mean, even the Warriors, that are still my favorite to win the title once again, if Steph is back, and he's going to be back, would have been a better matchup for the Wolves.
Let me go this direction. I entirely agree. And I think part of it is these are 2 very complete teams that are built for the coaching style of the coaches that they have, right? Mm-hmm. It seems like every other team in the West, what the Wolves figured out is you can allow one guy to go nuts and score, but you have to take everyone else out of the equation. And they were not able to do that against Houston. There's a phone.
Tom had a good idea.
Yeah, it's rare, and I get a noise. But you just can't do it. And my point with what they're doing in the offseason is, I guess maybe this in defense of Tibbs are kind of looking at this a little differently. Tibbs needs to be comfortable with his guys because he's got to realize to win in the West. I bet you, going back to your question about Wiggs and Towns, I think both those have a game of a lifetime, right? At one point in this series, and they still lose, and the message is going to be, dude, it doesn't matter. Like, you can go off Towns for 30 and 20, maybe. I mean, he'd go nuts in one game. Still won't win. Wiggins, you can drop 40. Still won't win the game. You need to have the supporting cast. You need to play with it.
And part of that's just, I mean, not to let Minnesota off the hook, but that part of that's just how good Houston is, too. Houston is built to beat everybody in the league.
Mm-hmm. Using, not Saber, or is it Sabermetrics? I don't know what it is, but Morey ball. And, like, I mean, they've optimized it on paper and in practice.
53% of their shots are threes.
I got two last questions, probably.
Sure.
How impactful can be the way they lose, because we assume they lose the series with Houston, for the future of Tibbs and the relationship we were talking about with the fan base, even the front office, but the fan base mostly. Mm-hmm. And you thought about firing Tibbs if he does not adjust. How realistic right now it is? Because I mean, I was one of the most vocal before. I mean, to me, if he didn't get the job done, because at the end of the day, he was hired to get the job done. Mm-hmm. He got the job done. It wasn't his best, his finest job, because 8th in the West with this talent is not his but he got the job done. So do you think it's realistically that his future is in jeopardy? I don't think so right now.
When the veteran sports writer Sid Hartman published a story this morning, a quote from Glenn Taylor that I thought was sort of telling was, "Thank God we made the playoffs," or something like that. I think that means something. Had they missed the playoffs, I don't know. But from a fan's perspective, and probably Glenn Taylor's perspective right now, I think making the playoffs was good enough to save Tibbs.
Serious questions would have been raised if they didn't.
Oh, for sure.
But if they lose all 4 games by 20 points or more, 18 points or more, there's going to be a certain group of fans, I think, that, one, are going to be just frustrated with And part of it will be just they don't realize how good Houston is, but I think there are going to be some fans that are going to be frustrated with that level of play, and then maybe some more diehard fans are going to be frustrated with the fact that we lost our first-round draft pick to get smoked by Houston. Was this really worth it? So I think there's certain aspects to it.
That's
but
me.
I think
I was just raising my head.
Okay.
You're one of those people?
I just think that's, and I don't know. I don't have good enough of a feel for how important 4 games getting swept is. That could still be really, I mean, to some degree, even that, the worst possible case scenario, getting swept, losing each game by double digits, still adds value to this Timberwolves roster. The question for me is, how much is that value? And I don't know. My assumption is that added value is not the same added value that having 2 first-round picks in this summer would have, and opening the possibilities for a roster overhaul that I believe is necessary to compete at the highest level, to become a contender in this. Where that line is, where do those 2 things match up? I would say winning a couple games in at least the first round of the playoffs. Giving yourself at least the chance, the opportunity, the idea, even if for a day or 2, that you have a shot, I think that boosts up the value of playoff experience. I don't know. I just don't think that it's extremely valuable to have experience and get swept.
So I have a point and then a question, or not a point.
I might be wrong on this. Wrong on this. I'm not pounding the table.
No, I know.
You might know later on. Right?
So how valuable is the simple fact that with them making the playoffs, past all the playoff drought, fan relief, etc., franchise relief, it's got to be a little relieving to just get the Adrian Payne trade behind you to a certain degree, because if you get 2 first round,
it's got to be now.
But if you get 2 first round picks this year, you're still losing one for next year, and I mean,
time value of money.
Well, sure, but it with the contracts set up the way they are, where a lot of change could happen next offseason. Wouldn't it be nice to have a first-round pick next season?
Not as nice as it would be to have this season.
But if you're talking overhaul, I mean, it won't garner immediate effect, and maybe that's scary because Jimmy Butler's contract is running out. If you're talking overhaul, true overhaul, having a first-round pick at a time when contracts are starting to expire might be helpful.
Yeah, I just don't think it's going to be more helpful than if 2 first-round picks can get them Kemba Walker this offseason, which I think is a realistic possibility.
Amazing. Yeah.
I think that's a realistic possibility. They need to make some money or something work like that. That's what this team needs to get to the next level, is not a third theoretical star that Andrew Wiggins is. They need a third all-star.
Do you think
that's the only way you're going to compete in the
Do you think
West.
2 first round? I was listening to the Ringer NBA show when coming over here, and I don't know his contract, and I don't even know if I want him based on just reputation right now. How do you think John Wall's going to be on the Wizards next year? I'm changing the subject. I'm changing the subject a little bit.
I like the idea.
$20 million more a year than what Kemba presents a unique opportunity because he's making $12 million next year.
What if you manage to dump Gorgie Jang's contract and Jeff Teague?
Each of them cost a first round pick to get off of. So,
but what if John Wall's value is dropped with the reputation?
Let's dive into this in the offseason.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's what I'm going into.
No, so one of my final points off of your point is what the Wolves need to do really soon is realize where their ceiling is, because that will tell you what contract, or if Tibbs is fired, right? What contract he gets or he's fired, and it does set expectations. You know what Van Gundy's upside is with the Pistons, and that's probably why he's going to get fired, right? You know where the Clippers hit their ceiling, and that ended up changing the role of Doc Rivers. Right now, Toronto's asking what their ceiling is. Like, this is what the Wolves need, this answer. They got to send, but they got to send fast so that we know that, because there's so many implications just in the near future for Tibbs, for the current players, for the fan base, and kind of the viability of the Timberwolves in the Minneapolis market.
And I think, unfortunately, the ceiling for this team is 3rd in the West right now, and I don't see that changing without, like you said, Dane, and it might be to your point of missing the playoffs and getting an additional first-round pick, somewhat of an overhaul, because I don't see any way that this current roster could be better than 3rd in the West. And I think with a couple wins against some teams that they should have beaten, that could have happened, but I don't see any scenario where anything better than that.
The overall's probably about as likely as them changing the way they defend pick and rolls.
So as of right now, they're like the Joe Johnson Hawks of the West, best case for a while, like third, fourth,
or the
second round,
or the towels of the seats before the games.
Yeah. So, what are your predictions?
I feel like we just left on a sour note.
No. Well, I'm going to get it more sour here. It's going to be a warhead in just a second. Let's go around the room quick. Predictions for the first round against the Houston Rockets. Riccardo, you're our friend of the program and guest. What are you thinking? Do they get a win?
I think they have a chance for a win. I don't think they get it, but I think they have a chance for one home win, and at least one game is gonna be very close, like a toss-up. But at the end, if I have, gun to the head, I would go for a sweep.
Sweep. Tom?
I'm going to go sweep, but I think the two games at home are entertaining and not fire Thibodeau.
Dane Moore.
I would have said, if you asked me this yesterday, that it would have been a sweep against Houston if I knew it was Houston. This is
gut feeling?
I have a gut feeling that they are going to win a game. And I think it's because it's the Timberwolves and just the way they've been. It's going to be a weird game, and I think it's going to be at Houston in Game 2.
Oh God!
And
That's
then
they're just going to get smoked at home.
And then they're going to lose the next 3.
I think
Houston might need to get punched in the face one time too. Maybe, I don't know. They've been coasting for a little bit. I think they're the best team. They're my pick to win the championship. And
let's remember that Houston in the playoff has to prove. That is on a different level. Let's remember that. I do, but I still don't feel comfortable anyway. But it's a good point to me because everybody assuming that regular season Houston is gonna be playoff Houston, and that is an assumption that is not correct, or at least is not proven yet. Because the previous season, it's an unknown. Because last season they were pretty good. Not as good as this season because Chris Paul wasn't there. Right. But I had Lou Williams, for example, in that roster that. He looks good this year in that Lakers.
Patrick Beverly.
In that Clippers uniform. Yeah. So, they had the pieces, and they didn't translate from the regular season to the playoff. So,
I think that's fair.
That's perfectly fair.
And I think Tim and I, either later this week or sometimes, we'll dig really deep into Houston in that matchup and kind of talk a little bit more about each of those players, and that'll be some point later this week. We know there's games. Game 1 is on Sunday, and
Game 2 is on Wednesday.
And Game 2 is on Wednesday. Yes,
very good.
It's gonna be fun. I think it's gonna be fun.
I think it's gonna be fun too. We're ending the podcast on a sour note because I'm predicting a sweep. No, we'll end it on a positive note. My dad predicted a 6-game loss. 6 Rockets in 6. Go, Dad. So.
Thanks for coming on, Riccardo.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
As always, Riccardo Pratesi. Where can people follow you on Twitter?
At rprat75.
Awesome.
And there is the translation button. He tweets in Italian, but you can translate it. And I
tweet some English too.
Yeah, sometimes when you interact with us, you tweet in English. Thank you for that. So for Tom Schreier at tschreier3, Dane Moore at Dane Moore NBA, I'm Tim Faklis at TIMFAKLIS. Game 7. Game 1 is on Sunday. We'll have more in the meantime. This has been another edition of Wolves Wired. We'll see you next time.